G'day crew, and welcome to the second part of the Sonar series. Again, I will mention that this series is aimed at those people who are not sonar gurus. I'm going to try and explain things in painful detail so that even those that have never used sonar before can get something out of it. That said, I hope you continue to watch and find it useful. I want to start by pointing out the various parts of the screen that I'm going to be using. This is a split screen to display two transducer frequencies at once. On the left is the low frequency window. You will recall from the previous video that the low frequency beam has a wider cone angle than the high frequency beam. That's important. On the right hand side of the low frequency window is the low frequency A scope. The A scope shows what is under the transducer at the exact moment that it is displayed. I'll talk more about this later. On the right hand side of the display is the window for the high frequency transducer. This has a narrower beam than the low frequency transducer, so what you see in it will be slightly different. On the right hand side of the high frequency window is the high frequency A scope. Again, showing everything that is in the beam of the transducer at that exact moment of time. Both the left and the right hand windows show exactly the same scene, just captured at different frequencies. I spoke about the difference in the thickness of the red line at the bottom in the previous video. If you're not sure why that happens, then it's worth having a look at that video. I'll put a link in the video description below. Just click where it says more. It'll open out, you'll see the chapters and the link in there. One thing you've probably already noticed is that there are more fish arches shown in the low frequency window. I've explained that in the previous video as well. If you're not sure why, go and have a look at that. You've probably also noticed that the fish arches are more well defined in the left hand window, that is the low frequency window. I'll explain why that is a little bit later in this video. And while I'm explaining the various screen areas, I'll just draw your attention to the white line drawn just above the red bottom. Most modern sounders have this ability, and I like to make use of it. The white line denotes what the sounder considers to be the hard bottom, and any mark above it will be a fish. It helps to find fish sitting very close to the bottom. And when I say hard bottom, I don't mean hard rocky bottom. I just mean what the sounder considers to be the ocean floor. It may be soft mud. I'll do a later video on how to tell what the bottom composition is or get an idea of what it is. Now that we have an understanding of the various screen areas, I want to play a section of video and talk about what's happening. I've slowed the video down considerably so that I have time to draw your attention to the interesting parts of the screen. You can see the return signal from the bottom and the fish directly in the transducer beams in the high and low frequency A scopes. As the return signal is recorded, it is shown in the moving maps to the left of the A scopes. Note how the pixel nearest the A scope is exactly the same as the image shown in the A scope, and the pixels further away from the A scope show what was in the A scope at that particular point in time in the past. And just as I was saying that, I realised that some of you may not know what a pixel is. It is the smallest element of a picture element, shortened to pixel, and it's one tiny dot on the screen. Back in the early days of sounders and computers, you could see the individual dots on the screen if you look closely enough. These days, screen resolutions are so high that it's very difficult to see the individual dots unless you get one that's a different colour to all the surrounding dots. I'm going to pause the video for a moment to look at the two images, compare them, and hopefully glean some of the information that they contain. Now, first of all, we've had a depth change from 20 metres to about 22 metres in a fairly short distance. There are fish on the sounder. The bottom appears to be reasonably firm, but as I said, I'll dedicate a later video to how to assess that. There's also some colour above the white line on the hard bottom. That could be weed or seagrass, which in turn may be the reason the fish are in the area. Now we've passed over that section of bottom, but it's still showing on the sounder, so where is it in relation to the bait? I'm letting this play through while I'm talking, just to reinforce the idea that what you see on the screen outside the A-scope is like a picture snapshot from the past. How far to the left of the A-scope it appears is meaningless in terms of distance as the boat travels, because how far it is to the left is measured in time, not distance. If you're drifting in a straight line at a low speed, let's say 1 knot, then you know it's somewhere behind you along the drift line. If you're really alert, good at mental arithmetic and estimating distances with few or no reference points, then you might be able to motor back to it. Me, I just drop a mark on my chart plotter and let the GPS do the hard work. On the other hand, if you're moving along under power, zigzagging, trying to find the fish, then the school you saw on the sounder could be anywhere. Mark it on your sounder, switch over to your chart plotter screen and head back to the mark. Now, before we had the luxury of sounders and chart plotters that you could see the marks on both, you had to be proficient at seeing it on the sounder and then turning around and putting your boat back roughly where you saw that fish. And it was possible, but I won't say it was easy to do. Because the fish are moving too, the boat's moving, you got no reference point on the water, painting a cross on the side of the boat doesn't help you at all. So it can be done, but modern technology just makes it so much easier. One question I have been asked quite a lot is what settings should people use on their sounder? I think I have mine set up pretty good most of the time, but I don't have a formula, so it's a bit difficult to explain to people what they need to do. I'll attempt to show you what I do and what I look for in the display to get what I want. We're just starting off here with the sounder in auto fishing mode. Until you get used to adjusting your sounder manually, that's probably as good a choice as any. Modern auto mode is certainly a lot better than it used to be in the past. I'll switch over to manual and adjust the various settings so you can see how they affect the image on the screen. First, I'll play with the gain. The adjustments I'm making here can be seen on the right-hand side of the historic image as it's coming into view. The changes I'm making affect the current signal being processed. If you look a little bit further to the left at the historic image that I'd captured using the auto fishing mode, it's quite different. This is because the adjustment I'm making is offset from whatever gain was set by the auto logic. The real image, that is the image that is being produced from the raw sonar return with the gain that I am setting, is only shown in the image that is generated after I selected manual mode. I hope all that makes sense. Just rewind a little bit and look at it a couple of times if you're not sure. What I'm looking for as I adjust the gain is a good image but with a little bit of clutter in it. If the image is too clean, meaning that you've got your gain set too low, then you're likely to miss seeing schools of bait fish. And if you want to catch big fish, bait fish are important. Once you have a gain setting to your liking, you can start to adjust the other controls to clean it up a little bit. The TVG control stands for Time Variable Gain, and it can be used to clean up the top water return. As the name suggests, it varies the gain in proportion to the time taken to receive the return. So the deeper the return, the more gain it applies to it. Be careful about cleaning up the top water return too much, because again you'll miss the schools of bait fish if you apply too much TVG. And finally, if you really must, you can use the clutter control to refine the image still further. I don't tend to use this at all really, as I think it tends to obscure what could be real fish returns. But if you'd like a cleaner image, go ahead and give it a go. At this point, if I still think the image could be better, I go back and adjust the gain control again and repeat the process, and keep doing that loop until I'm satisfied. I'll just also point out that because I have a split display showing high and low frequencies, I have to do these adjustments for each frequency separately. Furthermore, this is not something that you can just set and forget. If you are adjusting your settings manually in order to get the best out of your equipment, then you need to tweak the settings as water conditions change. That's not only the water depth, but the temperature, how dirty it is, etc. Now, getting it right is something of a matter of personal preference, and also something that you need to experiment with and practice until you master it. And on that note, I'll just mention that when I graduated from traditional 2D sounder to down vision and side vision, I spent 3 days on the water, without fishing, just trying to come to terms with it. There really is no substitute for spending time and experimenting with the settings. This is the bottom lock feature on my Furuno. Most other sounders will have a similar feature, or it may have a different name. What bottom lock allows me to do is to split the screen with the left-hand side looking at the bottom X meters of water. In this case, I'll set X to be 20 meters. So I'm looking at the bottom 20 meters of water on the left-hand side. The right-hand side of the screen shows the full water column as normal. This is particularly useful in deeper water when you're looking for demersal fish. When you're looking at the full water column, it can be hard to see fish returns that are near the bottom. With this feature, you can lock into the bottom X meters of water, which shows a larger arch for the fish, as we are effectively zoomed in on that area. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that there's a red line being traced 20 meters above the bottom. This allows me to see fish that are higher in the water column, as well as giving me a clear indication of which returns I should be seeing on the left-hand side. That is, those below that red line. Switching over to the high-frequency beam, we see fewer fish because of the narrower beam, but we do have better target discrimination. Bottom zoom is similar to bottom lock in that you can see the bottom in greater detail, but it differs in that bottom lock locks the screen on the bottom and allows you to see whatever distance from the bottom you want to see. In the example I gave, that was 20 meters. And it just uses the pixels on the screen to show the same image, but you get to see it bigger because you're looking at a smaller area, if you understand what I'm trying to say here. Because the area you're looking at is smaller, there's more pixels available to show the arch. Whereas with bottom zoom, it actually zooms in. Like you zoom in on the camera, it makes the image bigger in the available screen area. So this is the same thing. The arches are actually zoomed bigger than they actually would be, whereas with bottom lock they're showing the same size as they would be, but because we've got more pixels to show them, they appear bigger. So bottom zoom, you can make them bigger still. I don't use it much, I prefer bottom lock, but it does come in handy sometimes. Again, it's mostly for fishing deeper water when you're looking for demersal species. I said I was going to talk about how fish arches are formed. And understanding how they're formed is a key to understanding the differences between traditional sonar, down vision, side scan, 3D view, not to mention the differences in the various frequencies. Now I'll just mention here that with the B54 transducer and the DFF 3D black box, Furuno have come up with what I believe is the ultimate A-scope, at least for the current level of technology. I've shown it in previous videos and I'll talk about it in detail later in this series. For now I just want to say that I rely heavily on the data in the A-scope when I'm looking for fish. I'll start with just a simple situation of a fish passing through the beam of a transducer, and to illustrate this I'm going to use the 3D tuner models from the previous video and the 25-degree low frequency cone. In this scenario, the fish is cruising along 90 meters below the surface, minding its own business. When it encounters the sonar beam, the distance along the edge of the cone between the transducer and the fish is 92.6 meters. So that's the distance that the fish finder measures to the fish. By the time the fish is in the center of the beam, the transducer is reading the vertical distance to the fish, which is 90 meters. As the fish exits the beam, it is again measuring the diagonal distance from the transducer to the fish along the edge of the cone. I'll put all three pictures together here so that you can see the progression. And what I hope I've demonstrated here is that the arch is formed by the properties of the sonar beam itself, has nothing to do with the fish. It's the properties of the sonar beam that form the arch. And some sonar beams, their properties just can't form an arch. I'll talk more about them in a later video. Now I want to compare what we just saw in the 25-degree low frequency cone with the same scenario looking at it in the 6-degree high frequency cone. Now this time we get exactly the same thing happening, albeit on a smaller scale. When the fish enters the smaller cone, the diagonal distance from the transducer to the fish is 90.3 metres, and that's because the angle of the cone is much less. When the fish is directly under the transducer, the vertical distance is 90 metres, the same as it was in the 25-degree cone, because we're measuring the vertical distance at that point. When the fish exits the cone, the diagonal distance from the transducer to the fish along the edge of the cone is 90.5 metres. From that we can assume that the fish went down 0.2 metres on its transit. This results in a much less pronounced arch on the screen. It also means that the arch is shorter by virtue of the fact that it took less time for the fish to pass through the narrower cone. I have stretched the arch out a bit in these images to make it easier for you to see. But you can see that relatively the arch from the narrower cone is much smaller and less pronounced than the one from the low frequency wide cone. But that does bring up another point here that's worth mentioning. The slower you travel, the longer the fish will take to pass through the cone, and the easier it will be for you to spot it on the sounder. There's really no such thing as too slow when it comes to viewing fish on the sounder. Well, practically there is, but I'm trying to make a point here. You don't want to be travelling too slow when it comes to locating the structure where the fish might be hiding, otherwise it'll take you too long to inspect an area. I find 5 knots as a good compromise when looking for an area. I might see some structure or interesting bottom or some bait fish. Then I slow down to 2 knots or below to go back and look at that area in detail. Since this is such a key part of understanding where the fish is in relation to the transducer and why the arches look different at different speeds and frequencies, I'm going to go through this again with some animations to try and help you understand. Starting off looking from the right side, the fish is going to pass through the middle of the 25-degree beam from front to back. You can see the arch form on the blue sounder screen at the top left of the screen. I'll let that play for a few seconds so you can think about what's happening, then I'll point out the key takeaways. I hope by now that you've all noticed that by the time the arch is fully developed on the screen, the fish is outside of the transducer cone. Depending on the angle of your transducer cone and the depth the fish is at, that could be quite some distance from the bait. The only way you're going to see what is directly under your transducer is to watch your A-scope. Another key takeaway is that we are looking at a 2-dimensional representation on the screen of the 3-dimensional world that the sonar has scanned. In this animation, the boat is moving forward and the fish is swimming along and crossing the path of the boat. Yet the sounder shows exactly the same image that it showed when the boat was stationary and the fish swam from the front to the back. Now hopefully this has driven home the point that the screen shows nothing about the location of the fish within the cone, other than the depth at which it was scanned. It also shows nothing about the direction the fish was travelling relative to the boat. It just doesn't know. I've got a heap more that I want to say about using a traditional 2D sounder. In fact, I've got a lot more to say about it than I thought I did when I started this series. I'm taking it very slowly and trying to explain things in great detail because I've talked to so many people who just can't interpret what they're seeing on their sounders. I hope I'm not boring you too much by going into that detail. In the next episode, I hope to be able to include some on-water recordings from my sounders to show you how I determine what sort of bottom we're over, and also how I set them up. Before I publish that video though, I want to get out and do 1 or 2 more fishing videos and catch some more fish. So until then, good fishing.